Hey fearsome friends, I've got some close call creepy encounters for you all. From that creepy uncle to Mexican gangs, it's a crazy world out there for sure. So sit back, relax, get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. So a bit of backstory. As a kid, my family lived in a townhouse on the sketchy side of town. For reference, there was a drug deal going down in the open, in the middle of the day, and the people didn't seem to care that there were people coming from work and bringing their kids home from school, so there was a pretty huge amount of witnesses. Being the eldest, I always tried to watch out for my siblings, so I learned pretty early on how to read people. It started out simply enough at first. I knew who the worst people in the neighborhood were, so I watched how they acted and looked for those traits in other people. But by the time I was 10, it was pretty easy to pick up on even the slightest of red flags, and this may seem pretty random, but it comes into play later. At my elementary school, the turnover was insane. It was pretty underfunded, as schools in low-income areas are, and the quality of teaching staff went down as a result. It was so bad at one point that they had student teachers pretty much taking on classes themselves. I never minded much. I was motivated to succeed, so I was able to teach myself most things that they expected us to learn. One year, the guidance counselor quit. Big whoop. Nobody talked to him anyway. But then the new guy came about a week later, and I knew something was up. My number one rule when meeting a new person is to look them directly in the eye. I started doing it as soon as I started trying to read people, because I heard that thing about how the eyes are the window to the soul, and wondered if there was anything to it. They started bringing him around to the classrooms and introduced him to the teachers and students so that everyone knew who to talk to if they were having troubles at home or anything of that sort. They brought him into my class, and we were lining up to go to PE, so I had a clear view of the door when he walked in with one of the office staff. I looked directly into his face, like I did for everyone, and his eyes were different than any I'd ever seen. It was like looking into a shark's eyes. There was just nothing there at all. I'd seen deception, anger, sadness, and many other emotions in other people's eyes, but never nothing at all. Over the next couple of months, they had him going around to the classes every now and again, so he could gain our trust or whatever. And he was an odd guy. He was always fidgeting, couldn't meet the teacher's eye, and would try to avoid any sort of conversation with any authority figure. He avoided our principal like the plague. But when he was talking to us students, it was like he had laser focus, direct eye contact, maintaining command over the conversation, and giving hugs every so often to show support, or something along those lines. I also noticed that he had a grey patch in his hair that was shaped like a train, which I thought was the dumbest thing I'd ever seen, like he'd used a stencil with hair dye. It was so odd. I was intrigued because it was rare for me to not be able to read people at this point, so I watched him closely whenever he was around. One day it kind of just clicked when he was in my class. He was hugging on all of the girls exclusively, and talked to them differently as well, nervous around authority, and when he responded to questions it was almost like they were prefabricated responses, and if he didn't have one ready, he'd just change the subject. I told my mum when I got home that I thought this guy was a creeper, but she just kind of waved it off, because counsellors should be comfortable around people they counsel, which is a very valid point, so I just accepted it. One day I got one of my fingernails ripped off playing basketball. We played rough and I fell and slid across the concrete. And while I was in the nurse's office getting cleaned up, this dude came in and sat down on the seat next to me, which was comical, because they were those extra small seats made for kids. He threw his arm around my shoulder and started asking where my kid sister had been the past few days. A few things about me. I don't like being touched, even by my family, and I didn't and don't give out my info about my siblings, I also have a short temper that was already set off because I was in pain. I kind of shoved him away and told him not to worry about my sister. She had the flu or something, so she hadn't been at school for a couple of days. Nobody expected this out of me. I was quiet and polite normally, so he kind of backed off and gave me my space from then on. But one day the guy just stopped showing up to work, and nobody knew why. They scrambled for another guidance counselor after a while, and eventually found one, but I got my moment eventually. It turned out someone at the district or something started poking around in the records, and he bolted when he found out. In the end, they sent out a notice that he was one of those sketchy priests that got picked up for unsavory things in his ministry, and he wasn't even supposed to work around kids at all, but had just slipped through the cracks somehow. I normally would have been strutting around telling everyone that I had guessed it, but it was just the sickest feeling ever. This guy was asking about my sister, and I had luckily been telling my kid siblings to watch out for him, or who knows what could have happened. I got a call from a friend who asked if I would be interested in accompanying and driving him and another gentleman to the border of Reynosa and Texas. The job didn't pay much, and the last guy his company asked, who was a former Marine, turned down the job. So I agreed to the terms offered and had all my gear and equipment ready to go. The drive was nice, nothing creepy or dangerous, until after checking into the hotel, that is. So before I left, I decided I should check out the areas my clients would be, just in case of emergencies, etc. One location I was driving to was extremely close to the border, not too far from where the State Department had issued no travel warnings due to kidnappings and violent crime. Driving down this dirt road for a while, I decided to get out of my truck as I wanted to feel the vibe of the place, so to speak, when I saw a silver Chevy truck was approaching me. It immediately gave me an uneasy feeling, despite having on a vest and sidearm. I stayed calm and knew to play it cool, and if I was in harm's way, I'd try to fight it out. Maybe it's nothing, but I just felt very nervous for some reason. The Chevy pulled up, a little too close for comfort, but was a nice new truck with an extended cab and very dark tinted windows. I backed up a bit to position myself near the engine block of my vehicle, in case things got crazy, and after what felt like a lifetime, the window rolled down to reveal an older guy, asking me if I was lost, telling me that the area wasn't safe, and I should get out of there. He seemed like a decent guy so far. I thanked him and let him know that I appreciated his advice, and I'd be on my way shortly. When suddenly, completely out of nowhere, the guy started laughing and told me to leave while I still could. I immediately jumped into the passenger seat, slid over and took off. I was obviously worried, as anybody would be, but that was not the last of that truck, nor that guy, and a few guys who on nights would ride in that exact truck. The truck would continue to show up and follow me around at night, but I'm a stubborn dude, so one night I was out, I saw that my truck needed gas, and pulled up to a pretty shady spot to see what would happen. I went inside to pay and grabbed a drink, when a dude from that truck came in, and it was a younger guy this time, well built and tatted up, mean looking. Now I'm also tatted up and mean looking, and this dude asked me about a Grim Reaper tattoo on my forearm and what city I was from. I just made up a bunch of crap, as I wasn't going to say or tell anything about myself to this guy. Fast forward a few months later, when I asked a friend I know that's pretty familiar with the area what he thinks was going on with these guys. Now he grew up in Mexico, and his jaw dropped when I told him about the gas station encounter. He said I'd been lucky beyond belief, and that these guys, due to my tattoos, were checking to see if I belonged to any gangs. Had I had anything on me that meant something to them, I'd have been taken to Mexico and given a choice: join them or die a slow, painful death. I laugh about it now, but thinking about it, I really was lucky. I have prior gang associations, just nothing that would have given it away. I had the tattoos covered when I left the stupidity. So this happened when I was about 16, and I haven't thought about it in a very long time. But lately a lot of crazy memories have been popping up, and this is one of them, and it actually shocks me to my very core. It was pretty stupid what happened. I'm 28 now, and I advise no one to do what I did, but thankfully it ended well. A long time ago, when Coachella was blowing up, this was the last year that security was so lax, as loads of people were able to sneak in by jumping a fence. And after this, they tightened up security and turned it into the corporate festival that it is now. Anyway, I was able to convince my mum to let me go up for the weekend, but her only stipulation was that I had to be back by Monday morning for school. So the whole weekend went amazingly. But in my infinite wisdom, I had thought it would be smart to leave before the final act, so I could beat the crowd leaving the festival grounds. Even though it was the Gorillas, and this was their first reveal. Up until this, we'd only seen animated videos of them, but this was going to be their debut, and of course I missed it. So if you all don't know where Coachella is, it's in the middle of the desert in California, and it gets crazy hot. So I was wearing this tiny little get-up, short shorts, bralette, no jacket or anything else really, and I had driven up my 2 other friends in my car. But they decided to stay for the final act, so I had to go home alone. Now another thing my mum and her boyfriend ingrained in me was to remember where I'd parked my car. They even showed me an app that could locate my car, but of course my phone was dead by this time. But when we first parked, I had actually asked a parking attendant standing there doing nothing, whose only job it was to make sure the parking lot didn't get too crazy, how I was going to find my car easily later on. So he gave me a number, and I had it ingrained in my head. Now these parking lots were humongous. I have never been in one so big. And I think they had 2 to 3 separate lots. I'm talking 20 to 30 football fields. I really couldn't tell you though, because when you're walking around half naked at 12 AM in the freezing cold, by yourself at 16, every minute feels like a lifetime. I walked around one whole lot, which took about an hour or 2, before I realized that my car wasn't in it, and the asshole attendant had told me the wrong number. I know I didn't remember it wrong, because I had been repeating the number in my head since the moment he'd told me. I was destroyed and exhausted, and a little worried by then, but I knew I could only just keep looking. About 20 minutes into the search of the second giant lot, this old white truck came cruising up, and this older Mexican guy, I'm Mexican myself, started talking to me. I truly can't remember what was said between us, but I do know that I was pretty upset telling him how I couldn't find my car, when he said, "I can help you look." I know what you all are thinking, and please don't give me hate. I was so exhausted, and mulled over quickly how dangerous it was in my head. But I was so cold, so tired, and was almost close to giving up. In my stupid head, I just didn't think, and got in. When I first got in, I was so happy to be sitting down and out of the freezing cold that I couldn't stop thanking him. I was like this lost little bird, so sad and not knowing what to do. I wasn't rude or loud, I just kept saying thank you and how I needed to find my car. I don't know if I had a guardian angel that night or what, but he seriously did drive up and down every aisle for about 30 minutes, and this was in a car, so you can only imagine how big these lots were, and I swear we actually drove upon my car. I remember just bursting into tears and couldn't stop thanking him enough as I got out of his car with no problems, and that was that. But what I find scary on looking back was what the hell was this older man doing, driving around in the parking lot while a concert was still going on. It's not like he was waiting to pick someone up. Also, this was in the middle of nowhere, so why would he go all the way there just to be a ride? Even though what he did was nice, he didn't have that warm vibe you would picture of someone doing something like this. For the life of me, I can't remember him saying anything to me, good or bad. I know he wasn't completely silent, because that would have been incredibly terrifying, and I definitely would have remembered that. But I know he definitely wasn't talkative, and I know he didn't say anything about himself or what he was doing there, because I remember being just as freaked out then as I am now by the encounter. I do remember going over it in my head and thinking it was so weird that I knew nothing about him and what he was doing there. I have come across serial killer accounts where they say they didn't hurt an almost victim because of something they did or said, and I just wonder if I'd escaped being a victim because I was so young, naive and sweet. Like I said, from the moment I had opened his car door, I couldn't stop thanking him. Even now at 28 years old, I look incredibly young, like 16 to 18 young, so I could only imagine how even more young I looked back then. I have no idea. This could have just been nothing. The only slightly logical explanation I can think of for him being there is maintenance, but even though his truck could have possibly been that, I really don't think it was. It was just an old white truck. Plus, most of the workers were young people who were also there to party themselves, or if they really were there to work, they were not on the grounds at midnight. Also, workers and parking attendants had little outfits, which he didn't. It was just a shirt he could have taken off easily, but it's still just very strange. I want opinions, so please tell me what you all think. So this happened about 5 to 10 years ago, so my memory is a little hazy. But I do remember it rather well. I was maybe 20 to 23 years old. I'm a male and it was around 10 to 11 p.m. at night. I was driving to my ex's house. We were still friends, and I noticed an odd sound coming from my car. I thought it was possibly a flat tire, so went to a gas station that was on the way. Now, I went to this place often to fill up and maybe buy a drink, so I pulled in and started looking around the car. And sure enough, I had a flat tire. I started the process of removing it, and after fumbling with my tools for a while, a car drove right up behind mine, which I thought was odd, but whatever. I was having a hard time getting the wheel off, when the guy from this car got out and walked up close to me. I don't remember how he greeted me, but he wanted some money and asked me if I could give him some. My heart rate rose a bit, but luckily the gas station had people around, so I felt fairly safe if he were to have threatened me. I replied, "No, I don't carry cash," which was a lie, and I figured that'd be the end of it. Now there was a woman in his car that looked more than sketchy. I don't know if she was a junkie or something, but she didn't seem right at all. Red flag number 1. He then asked if I could just take a ride around the block with him. I said, "No, I'm trying to fix my tire." I started to get nervous. I can't remember how the conversation went exactly after that, but I know he kept asking, "Come on, let's just take a drive around the block." Images in my head flashed of these people robbing me and possibly murdering me, when finally he said, "Hey, have you ever had your dick sucked? I mean, really sucked?" I didn't know how to reply to this, but I think I finally said, "I'm okay, thanks, I just really want to change my tire." He finally relented after seeing I wasn't going to do what he wanted, and went back to asking for money, but from someone else this time, calling out to other people. Funnily enough though, he actually helped me change my tire for some weird reason. As soon as he did, he drove away, and I bolted to my ex's, whilst looking around to see if he was following me, which thankfully he didn't. This story happened to my best friend, and she was 14 at the time, about 4 years ago, and it was even in our local newspaper. So we both lived in the same street next to a big park with lots of wildlife, small forests, ponds, and a big river. It's actually really, really pretty, and people often go there for a walk with their dogs or to swim in the river. The thing is, though, most people do that when the sun is still up, because there are no lights there. So basically everything is pitch black by around 6 p.m, except the old football field, which is on the opposite side of the river. Also, there aren't any houses nearby. Our street is next to the entrance of the park, and next to the park itself lies a big, big graveyard. Now, my best friend is like a dog whisperer. She would often help out dog owners who weren't able to go on walks with their dogs due to work or other things. And that's why she would often take care of Happy, a little white chihuahua. This one evening, it was around 5 p.m, when she and Happy were walking on a small path in the middle of the big park that I'd mentioned earlier. She was on her way home when she noticed a guy sitting on a bench around 10 meters in front of her. He was looking straight at her and moving his hand around in his pants. I think we all know what he was doing, and this immediately scared her. So she started to walk faster, because she had to pass him to be able to get home. As she did so, she tried to avoid any eye contact, and after maybe another 10 meters, she turned around and saw that he was now standing on the path and still looking at her. She started to walk again, now even faster, and turned around a second time. But now guess what? What he had been doing wasn't even the worst part. He then started to run towards her. She grabbed her dog and ran as fast as she could away from him, trying to get home before he could catch up to her. He was literally chasing her for around 5 minutes, until she was at the entrance of the park, where she saw an old couple. She ran towards them, completely exhausted, shaking, with tears in her eyes, and asked them to call the police. The perv saw the couple and thankfully turned around, and she later on described him to the police. I was so shocked when she told me that story, and I don't even want to think what could have happened to her if the guy had caught her. Maybe I'm overreacting, but I truly believe that he would have raped her, or even worse. It's bad enough that the police weren't able to catch him. So this happened, I think, in 2018 or 2019. My mum and I had taken her parents back home after they had had dinner with us, I think celebrating a birthday maybe. But as we turned the corner to head home, we saw this woman and man arguing. My mum and I slowed down to have a look, and I turned our loud music down so we could hear what was going on. We turned around and drove past them again, and did this 3 times before pulling over. We wanted to get an accurate feel for the situation and not overreact, as it could have just been a domestic argument or a drunken one. We eventually pulled over just as the guy raised his fist. The poor lady flinched and was sobbing so loudly, so I called the police, and my mum and I watched everything that was going on the whole time. We drove back around the corner to keep an eye on them as the woman was walking away from the guy, and now this dude was following after her, yelling. As we parked up again, we noticed the cops as they'd been driving by and noticed the situation. We got out of the car and went to see what was happening, and we let the police know that we had called them earlier, and they said they'd just received it themselves. They were struggling to push this man in handcuffs into the car, as I think he was probably drunk. The lady hid behind my mum, sobbing, rambling, not making any sense. She was very small, maybe just under 5 foot, and my mum was blocking her with her own 5'1" form, hiding this poor woman from the angry man, who was swearing up a storm. I put myself between the man in the cop car and my mum and this lady, just in case. We were there for just under an hour maybe, and we found out that the man was her husband, and he was regularly abusive. She told us that she'd tried leaving, but she can't leave her son behind, and she's too scared to anyway. She lives with her husband and his mother, who joined us not long after the man was handcuffed and tried to comfort the woman. But it seemed she was just as scared of the mother as she was of the husband, as apparently the mother was also abusive and violent. The police took the man and the mother away and drove the lady home and then to a safe house. We spent 20 minutes giving the cops our statement, and I've never felt that angry and ready to get violent before. I was absolutely prepared to beat the crap out of this dude if he so much as stepped towards us. I wish I knew more about the woman, and wish I could know how she's doing now. I hope she's doing okay, and I hope that man gets locked away and gets some serious help. Also, his mother. So I'm a 30-year-old female, and currently a nursing student. I'm going to tell you about a particular Thanksgiving from 2020 that went from exciting to creepy for me quite quickly. It started off with me passing an exam at 86%, spending pre-Thanksgiving with my boyfriend and his family. He was leaving for a Cal Fire base. But this particular night before Thanksgiving, I spent at my brother's house, then left for home around 8 a.m. I woke up exhausted, but my mental state turned manic, and I was awake and wanting to get my sister a surprise gift from me and her kids. But she hadn't replied, and in my crazy state of mind, I decided to just go to her house. The day was fun. There was lots of food, booze, and dancing, and I loved it. Around 6 p.m, I'd planned to travel to my boyfriend's temporary living, but we got into a bit of an argument, as I told him since I was a 3-hour drive away, I'd start around 1 a.m. He didn't agree with this, though, as he thought it would be too late and too dark to travel to a rural area, which prompted me to remind him that I was a grown woman. He became a bit upset with this. However, later we came to an agreed time for my arrival, and the festivities went on at my sister's house. Alcohol fun, Thanksgiving family pictures, and food. At around 11 p.m, I decided to take a nap, but I decided to take a shower first, and due to me needing help with running the shower and attempts to fix my hair, I ended up laying down around midnight. I slept until 1 a.m, but I overslept even though I had set my alarm to wake up at 1. I woke up at 3:30 a.m. by my sister asking me why I hadn't left yet. I immediately woke up and desperately moved as fast as I could to get on the road. But in my hurry I left my phone and had to turn around to go get it. Once retrieved, I was finally on my way for a second time, but ended up going the wrong way, as I'd mixed up 2 cities' names because they both started with CH. But once the GPS was on, and I realized I was going in the wrong direction, I was eventually going the right way. The first hour of the journey was really frustrating, because at that time I thought I'd left my vape pens. Thanks to my sister telling me I'd left my pens, which she meant actual pens, not vape pens. Not her fault. I subsequently found the vape pens 2 days later in my purse. Once leaving the city lines of Sacramento, I got into a race with a Silverado through my jealousy that I was in an SUV versus a beautiful truck, and I decided to take the race on, until I reached 120 for about 10 minutes and decided it wasn't worth the ticket. At the time it was only me, the Silverado, and a Ford on the road, and about 5 minutes later the Silverado took an exit, so it was just only me and the Ford in the rural dark area. After a while I noticed the Ford was on the side of me, and at one point seemed to be close enough on my right side to swipe me. Due to my blindness in the dark, I was more focused on making it safely and not focused on the car that seemed to be even cutting off other cars to be on the side of me. This was only a 2-lane road in one direction, so you can understand why it wasn't too much of a bother. We made it to a small town that meant taking a major street for about 3 to 5 miles, going through stoplights, and at one point I thought, damn, I hate it when people are close to me. But after 2 lights, the Ford turned off and I felt a bit childish for even caring. Then 2 to 3 lights down, as I made it through the green light, I noticed a car turning onto the street. It was the same car, and at this point my body started to shake as it made sure it was back on the right side of me, keeping up with me persistently this time. My head began to hurt, and at first I didn't understand the fear that was kicking in. Why would this car come back to the main street? There are only 3 other cars, and he's the only one on the side of me. The fight or flight response was creeping up, and I didn't want to turn my head. In that moment, I didn't want to call my boyfriend either, as what if I was just paranoid? I'd travelled alone for longer distances at night before. Was the alcohol still in my system? My boyfriend and Mom would lose it if I called them. Why was this happening? Don't panic. Then in that moment I saw a light turning yellow as we approached side by side. My brain went into rationalization and thought, don't panic, stay calm and ignore the headache. When the light turns green, stay, see if he goes. We approached the light and stopped, and it seemed to be a much longer wait time than the others. I moved my eyes towards the Ford on the side of me, and I could see that the windows were lightly tinted, but I could make out a hat and a person looking towards me. Then seconds later, I looked up at the light and then peered back into my passenger window. My head and heart became one, both in pain and fear. Then the light turned green, and there were 2 cars behind us. I stayed on my brakes, but I didn't move, and I didn't see his car enter the intersection either. I turned my head to look, and could now see more of a silhouette of the man's face under the hat staring at me. I took off slowly to collect my composure and not let him know I was scared, but he moved off with me, keeping my pace of slowly going through the intersection. Suddenly a car behind us beeped the horn, and it was like a light switch. I noticed a truck in the distance through the last light that was making it through the abyss of the rural highway, and was only a 1-lane road, so I decided to speed up to make the last light, with the Ford still keeping up with my pace. It seemed that he was trying to cut me off, but I went from 45 to 65 to where the trucks were going slowly, and the Ford was now so close behind me that I couldn't see his lights in full. I panicked and went off the side of the road as to pull off to pass up the truck, but so did he. When I noticed he'd passed the truck and was still just as close behind, I noticed the second truck. I sped up to 90 and went towards the left, which was into oncoming traffic, to cut off the truck. My rationalization was to speed, and even if I was pulled over, I'd be safe, I hoped. I cut the big rig truck off and began to speed up, now able to see far behind me in the distance through my rearview mirrors, and I could see the car trying to cut trucks off to the right and left. But cars were coming in the opposite lane, and due to the trees to the right, the Ford seemed to weave in and out of the lane. He was trying to erratically cut off the truck. By now even the truck lights were far behind me, and I was going about 120 miles an hour. I continued with no effort, as I am an experienced fast driver, and my adrenaline made it easy, although I was still shaking and crying, and the headache became unbearable. After about 5 to 10 minutes, I slowed to 80 miles an hour, and then down to 65 after about 30 minutes. An hour later I stopped at a store that appeared to be busy with customers, which prompted me to stop, as I was paranoid and couldn't be 100% sure the Ford wasn't nearby. I went into the store to grab food and coffee, but my appetite was gone, so I decided just on coffee and a smoke. Walking into the store, I saw both customers and employees give me a wide-eyed look, followed with a look of sorrow, which made me feel embarrassed. I was shaking, and my makeup had run all over my face from the crying. I'm sure I looked like I was coming down off of drugs, because my sympathetic nerve was transferring its hard work over to the parasympathetic nerve. I went to pay for my coffee and asked for some smokes, but the shaking made it hard for me to enter my PIN for my debit card and had to try 3 times. Walking back to my car, I was terrified. My head was pounding in my ears, and I hoped some tobacco would calm me. The smoke seemed to help calm me down a little, but the shaking and headache persisted in an unbearable manner. The sun was coming up, and I was almost there. I was still shaking and upset, crying on and off. Of course, when I made it to my boyfriend's house, he could sense something was up, and was able to get the truth out of me. I could see he was upset, but he tried to console me with a hug and a kiss, and encouraging rest so I could calm down. It was hard to study that day, and the headache persisted. So I stayed in bed, and my boyfriend said I was to not make any more late-night drives. He even made sure I stayed at his house until he was off and with me. Days later, and I'm scared to go out at night. I wish I would have listened. 30 or not, no person, male or female, should think it's okay to drive into rural areas at night. There are so many crazies out there. Back in high school, my friends and I, who were 18 at the time, would go to a sports oval after dark and smoke and drink alcohol, etc. The usual loser teenage stuff. One particular night though, I hit the bottle a little too hard and ended up spending the night passed out at the oval. I woke up still a bit drunk and realized someone had taken my glasses away from me so I wouldn't break them during my drunken antics. I thought that was kind of them, but now I had to work out how to get home without my glasses, and this was before smartphone turn-by-turn navigation. Thankfully, when I started walking though, I saw my good friend Hannah was walking just ahead of me, identified by her long brown hair. Hannah and I live very close to one another, and we had been drinking together the night before, so I started blindly following Hannah as a way of getting home. About half an hour later, Hannah suddenly sprinted down the driveway of a random house that wasn't hers. I was perplexed, but a bit more sober now, so was able to find my way home unassisted. But only later did I realize that Hannah was not Hannah, and just some random girl with long brown hair. So from her point of view, she was innocently walking in the early morning, when some drunk 18-year-old woke up and proceeded to follow her for half an hour in total silence, copying her every move. From her point of view, it was clear that I was following her. I later went back to the driveway she sprinted down to apologize, only to find that she didn't live there. So she must have just run down a random person's driveway to get away from me. I still feel bad almost 10 years later. So my uncle was a creep at definitely the wrong moment. Our family was all together at this time back in 2019 because we had just lost my nan. He started talking to me about what I was wearing and how I had lost weight. I was wearing a nice black dress with a white cardigan and black leggings and was sitting next to my dad, who was also visibly uncomfortable. My uncle had always been close to us, but he never really spoke with me. He then started talking about my hair and that it was a shame I'd cut it, blah blah blah. I was confused as I was just there for a free meal and to feel sad about my nan's death with my mum, who was going through a rough time. He kept on talking more and more to me about fishing and how he was going to take me out with him and his girlfriend one day. But at that moment I was thinking more about how his girlfriend had tried to murder him, and now they were back together. He was looking at me more and more, which made me really, really uncomfortable. But then he put his hand on my thigh. I moved seats to swap with my dad, and I just carried on comforting my mum. My dad spoke to him about what was happening just then, and he said, "Oh, that. I was just fixing her dress as it was wrinkling." When my dad told me that that's what he said, I was so confused. I mean, it's meant to wrinkle. I'm sitting down after all. My dad reassured me he wasn't trying to make any advances, and that everything was fine. I believed it for the most part, as I've known this man my whole life, even though he was a creep for some of it. For example, the time he let me sit on his lap when we drove around the complex. He let me steer the car, and I was only 4 or 5 at the time. It was cool in retrospect for me, being 5 and thinking he was so cool, but he didn't tell my parents we were going for a joyride in his new truck. So he was always a creep, and I was genuinely scared of him my whole life. He did it once more a few months after this, and me and my parents have stayed clear of him since. Or at least I was never alone with him. So this happened last Saturday, when 3 friends and I went to our favourite local bar. It's very much a neighbourhood joint, and is one of those small places where you can quickly make friends with the staff. Around 9 PM or so, a group of 4 came in and sat at the table across from us. It was 2 guys and 2 girls, and if I had to guess, they were all in their late 30s, early to mid-40s. My friends and I are early to mid-30s, but some of us look younger. And about an hour later, one of the guys came over to our table and asked if one of us could drive him and his friends to their hotel, offering to pay the driver $50. I didn't drive that night and caught a ride with one of my friends, so he and I were out. One lied and said he lived nearby, and the final friend, who drove a truck, said he didn't have the room. The guy was insistent though, and took his phone out to prove that he couldn't get an Uber at that moment and said, "Well, if you change your minds, just turn around." During this conversation, he also noted that they were Philly adjacent. Now we live in northeast Pennsylvania, and are about 2 hours or so from Philadelphia. When we asked for more details about them, he said they were from the Lancaster area, but that's not Philly adjacent. We weren't sure why they'd decide to drive out 2 hours to northeast Pennsylvania for a birthday, when it didn't appear that they had any ties to the area. 15 minutes later, the guy bought our table a round of shots to do with his friends. They said they were celebrating the one girl's birthday, and they asked my one friend, the one who drove me, how old he was. He said 30, and they all joked and remarked on how they thought he was 22. We thought that was a bit odd. After he'd left, my one friend pulled up Uber and said that there are cars available, so he suspected the guy may have turned his location settings off. Now there were other people in the bar as well, and they never asked anyone else for a ride, even the bartender. 11 PM came around, and it was last call in Pennsylvania right now due to COVID. They asked a final time, and again offered the $50, but we still all declined, and they finally asked the bartender to call them a cab. We never felt in immediate danger, but had a weird vibe from these people. Were they just awkwardly friendly drunks, or was something else going on? We are all divided. My one friend suspects they were swingers looking to party. One thinks that they were looking to score drugs, and the other thinks they were planning to rob one of us once they'd got the ride. Me? I'm not so sure, but I'm leaning towards swingers. So this is something that happened to me quite recently. I'm an 18-year-old boy who is 6'2", with an athletic build, so I've never felt threatened or scared walking around places, even after midnight. So every time I go to my friend's house, I pass a school. There is this old security guard, probably in his 50s, who is always sitting there, and I don't know why, but I always felt like he was looking straight at me whenever I passed, no matter how many people were walking beside me. I learnt to shrug it off though, just thinking it was all in my head. He was causing me no harm, so what was the problem? So rewind to 5 days ago, when I was walking home from my friend's house, and this security guard called me towards him. Now this is where my head lets out a huge brain fart, and I walked right over to him. He shook my hand and put his arm around me, like we were about to pose for a photo. He asked me my name and where I lived, and the answers to his questions just flew out of my mouth during the brain fart moment, although I didn't tell him the exact location to where I lived, but I was stupid enough to give him a vague idea of the street number. He was telling me about how studying in school is good, and students should study harder nowadays to end up scoring bigger jobs, all of which caused me to let my guard down, thinking he was just a good man. All the while though, his arm was still around me, and I was standing there nodding my head. He kept going on like this for about 5 minutes, when I eventually said that it was getting late and I needed to go home. He gave me this visibly upset face, which weirded me out a lot. Then he said, "Okay, it's all right. I see you often, so I'll talk to you the next time." And I kid you not, he went in for a kiss on my cheek. I wanted to beat the crap out of him when he did that, but I just pushed him aside a little and said, "Why did you try to kiss me?" He just laughed and said, "You're not a girl," then went back inside the school. During the rest of my walk home, my mind kept thinking about ways I could handle this situation, whilst also feeling this weird urge to cry. I'd never felt like that before, and I was deciding on whether to confront the guy the next day or not. It all just felt so weird. I ended up not taking that route though, and chose to walk a longer, different route from that day on. I still think about that a lot, and I may confront him soon, if just to lift this weight off my mind. So I'm a 20-year-old female and I work at Walmart. I've been working there for a while now, and I've kind of gotten to know most of the regular customers, some of which I check out occasionally, the rest prefer to go self-checkout. Now this creepy encounter happened on a Sunday afternoon. I was just finishing clocking out and had to do some holiday shopping. Once I was done, I went to the self-checkout, and whilst there I could hear the person next to me cussing and talking to themselves. I instinctively looked over to realise he was one of our regulars, who I will call Ken. Once I'd finished checking out my items, I proceeded to walk outside with my Christmas bag and my Walmart vest inside it. This is important. And as I was waiting for cars to pass by at the crosswalk, I saw Ken standing beside me. I paid him no mind as we waited for the cars to pass by. I took my mask off, and through the corner of my eye I could see Ken just staring at me. I started to get a bit annoyed with this, but 3 seconds later, a driver gave me the chance to cross the street to get to the parking lot where I was parked. As I proceeded to cross the road, I could feel someone following behind, so I began to walk faster. Then as I was close to getting inside my car, I heard someone yell, "Hey!" Me being the dumbass I am, turned around. But the reason being is that I've had times where I've dropped something on my way out. But not this time. It was Ken, who was following me. I answered, "Can I help you, sir?" He went on to say that I had beautiful hair, and I've gotten compliments about it before, so I said, "Thank you." And as I tried to get into my car to leave, he started chatting about wanting to go out with me, have dinner, and go to his house. I politely declined and told him I had to go home. but then he asked me how old I was. Now, since I looked like I'm 16, I told him I was, at an attempt to deter him. He then started to talk about how he could get in trouble because I was a minor, and just started to say, "Wow," while taking deep breaths and telling me that I wasn't built like a 16-year-old. He then asked me what I was doing there, and because I was panicking, I told the truth. "I work here," I said, realizing what I had just said, and I regretted it instantly. Then all of a sudden the man's eyes lit up and he said, "I've never seen you here before." I immediately responded by saying I was moving stores, and the whole time we were talking, I was trying to get the attention of other cars without making it too obvious. I had a few stares, but no one bothered to help. As I had been doing this, Ken had been getting closer to me. Then he started to caress my hair, in a creepy, "let me smell your hair" type of way. I immediately went into panic overdrive and insisted I needed to get home. Finally, he left me alone. But the worst part was that I had pepper spray in my bag. But because I was panicking so much and thinking I was going to get kidnapped, I didn't end up using it. It's always easy to say what you should have done in hindsight, but in reality it very rarely works out that way. I still have to see this creep, but thankfully he doesn't recognize me. And yes, next time I see him, I will humiliate him for wanting to get with a minor, for touching me, and will also proceed to RKO. My experience takes place a few years ago when I was 19 at the time. I'm a woman and I was walking alone, coming back from my boyfriend's house around midnight. The weather was nice and I was enjoying my night walk. I had both my earphones in, listening to music as I was waiting at a red light, but there weren't a lot of cars around at that hour. The path I took was pretty well lit for the most part, but there was that intersection and a part of the street that was almost completely dark. As I was approaching this darker area, I went to cross the intersection, and I kind of walked in a diagonal, going to my left, when I heard a man yelling behind me. I turned around to see a dark blue-black 4Runner-looking car that was in the diverging lane of that intersection. The windows were tinted, so I could only see the driver, who had his upper body out of the car window whilst yelling something at me. The car had stopped in the middle of diverging lane, so I stopped walking, took out my earphones, and that's when I heard, "Get in the car! Get in the car!" Taken aback, I asked him, "What? What do you mean?" The man was getting visibly angrier by the second. Now, I had been in the middle of the street for maybe 30 seconds, and in that short amount of time, I registered that there was no one around, no vehicles and no passers-by. All I could see was that the only way to go back to my house was either through an open field or the darker street on my left. This car was on my right and approximately 6 meters from me, and now the man was still yelling for me to get in his car when I heard another door slam. Now, when I tell you I ran for my life, I mean it. I started running towards the dark street and didn't look back. I was already meters away from the car, so I knew I had a chance to escape. Then I saw a line of bushes on a property and hid behind them. Whilst here, I noticed that I couldn't hear footsteps, so I peeked out to see if the vehicle was still there, and it was. The second I looked at it, the driver peeled off and went in the opposite direction. But still, I ran home looking everywhere around me and stopping to hide every so often to make sure the car wasn't there. I called my boyfriend when I was hiding in the bushes, and he was on the phone with me until I got home. I know I should have called the cops, but in those situations, the only thing you can think about is to get home safe as fast as you can. I never saw the other person that slammed the door, but I did hear a car door slam from that vehicle, and it wasn't the driver. He was still yelling from his window. Since the windows were tinted and it happened at night, I never thought that someone else could be in the car with him. The only thing I could think about was that I was about to get chased by that other person. To this day, I have no idea of what they'd intended to do. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't started running when I did, but I prefer not to think about it. Please be safe out there, and take the necessary precautions. It's a crazy world. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.